Claire Dawson looked like any young mother in a quiet suburban neighborhood, but behind her closed doors, a spiral of addiction, neglect, and hidden violence was building toward an unthinkable act that would shock the entire community. The quiet suburbs seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Rows of houses lined the narrow streets, each with its own manicured lawn and flower beds. Neighbors greeted each other during evening walks, and children rode their bikes until sunset. Among these peaceful surroundings stood a modest two-bedroom apartment, its white paint peeling slightly at the edges. Inside lived 22-year-old Claire Dawson. To anyone passing by, she was just another young mother adjusting to life with her newborn. She had given birth to a baby boy 3 weeks earlier, and while she smiled politely to neighbors, her private life was anything but picture perfect. The moment the door closed behind her, the warmth and order of the outside world faded. The apartment was dim, curtains often drawn to block the light. A faint smell of stale alcohol clung to the air, mixing with the sour scent of unwashed laundry. The kitchen counter was littered with half-empty bottles, a silent testimony to her restless nights and uneasy days. Claire had once promised herself that motherhood would change her, that the baby would be the reason to start fresh and leave her old habits behind. But the reality of caring for a fragile, constantly crying infant was harder than she ever imagined. Sleep came in short bursts, and meals were often skipped. The baby's cries pierced through her like glass splintering in her ears, and instead of comfort, her mind searched for escape. At first, the drinking was occasional, just a glass to take the edge off, but one glass became 2, then 3, until the line between day and night blurred. She found herself drinking before noon, hiding the bottles in cupboards and behind stacks of dishes so no one would see. Friends who had visited in the early days after the birth began noticing changes. She spoke less about her baby, avoided taking pictures, and canceled visits with vague excuses about being tired. When neighbors caught sight of her in the hallway, she often seemed distracted, fumbling for her keys, eyes red as though from crying or perhaps from something else. The baby's needs grew with each passing day, but Claire's ability to meet them was shrinking. While others might have seen a young woman overwhelmed by new responsibilities, inside her apartment, the balance was tipping towards something dangerous. The isolation, the exhaustion, and the constant pull of alcohol were combining into a silent storm. No one watching from the outside could have predicted how quickly that storm would break or the devastation it would leave behind. Claire's drinking had started long before the baby was born, woven into her daily life like a bad habit she couldn't shake. It began in her late teens as weekend partying, but over the years it became a crutch she leaned on for every disappointment, every argument, and every moment she wanted to forget. By the time she learned she was pregnant, she had already been drinking almost every day. At first, the news gave her a rush of determination. She promised herself and others that she would stop for the sake of the baby, but the cravings were stronger than her resolve, and the isolation of her small apartment made it too easy to give in. She convinced herself that just a little wouldn't matter, that she could stop anytime she needed to. In the early months of pregnancy, she managed to hide her drinking from most people. She avoided social gatherings, claimed she was tired from work, and rarely let anyone into her home. Even when the doctor warned her about the dangers, she nodded politely and went back to her old habits. As her belly grew, so did her dependency. The quiet evenings were filled with the soft pop of bottle caps and the slow burn of liquor sliding down her throat. When the baby finally arrived, she thought it might mark a turning point. Holding him in the hospital, wrapped in a tiny blanket, she imagined a new life where she would be the mother he needed. But the exhaustion hit quickly, and the weight of caring for a newborn alone crushed any hope of change. She began using alcohol again within days of coming home, telling herself it was the only thing keeping her calm enough to get through the endless crying. It didn't take long for her drinking to spiral further. A single glass in the evening became morning sips, and soon she was topping off her coffee with liquor before the sun came up. The baby's cries, once a signal to feed or comfort, now felt like a constant assault. She avoided looking directly at him for long periods, as though eye contact might force her to feel something she had buried deep down. Neighbors occasionally caught muffled sounds through the walls, sharp noises, hurried footsteps, but dismissed them as the usual struggles of a tired parent. Beneath that assumption, Claire's frustration was hardening into something darker, the kind of bitterness that, left unchecked, would lead to an irreversible breaking point. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in the middle of a relentless storm. Rain lashed against the apartment windows, and wind howled down the narrow street. Inside, the dim light from a single lamp barely illuminated the cluttered living room. Empty bottles were scattered across the coffee table, the sharp smell of alcohol mixing with the musty air. Claire had been drinking since early afternoon, each glass dulling her thoughts but sharpening her irritation. By nightfall, the baby's cries had been echoing through the apartment for hours, an unyielding sound that seemed to grow louder with every passing minute. Her hands trembled as she clutched another drink, the liquid sloshing over the rim. The sound of the baby's wails felt unbearable, like needles pressing into her skull. She paced back and forth, her bare feet sticking slightly to the unclean floor, each step quickening with her growing agitation. The rational part of her mind was fading, replaced by a haze of anger and exhaustion. She told herself she just needed silence, just a moment of peace, but the crying only intensified. The moment she approached the crib, it was no longer about calming the child. Something inside her had snapped, and her actions were no longer guided by reason. What followed was sudden and violent, the kind of act that happens in a blur but leaves permanent damage. The apartment fell into a heavy, unnatural silence almost instantly. Claire stood frozen, breathing hard, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but instead of reaching for the phone, she stepped back, her heart pounding in her ears. She convinced herself the baby might still wake, that maybe she had overreacted and it wasn't as bad as it seemed. She sat on the couch, drink still in hand, staring into the shadows as the storm continued outside. Hours passed without movement, the reality sinking deeper with every glance toward the crib. Panic began to mix with denial, but her intoxicated state dulled any sense of urgency. The life that had once made her promise to change was now gone, and the apartment's oppressive quiet seemed to mock her with every tick of the clock. Outside, the rain showed no sign of stopping, and neither did the darkness that had taken hold inside those four walls. For the next 2 days, Claire barely moved from the couch. The curtains remained shut, trapping the apartment in a constant state of dim gloom. She avoided the crib, glancing toward it only when her eyes wandered without thought, and each time she did, a wave of dread swept over her. The air inside grew heavier, thick with the smell of neglect, and something far worse beginning to settle in. She drank constantly, using each sip to blur the sharp edges of her fear. Empty bottles piled up around her like a barricade against reality. Her phone buzzed with missed calls and unread messages, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. Neighbors began to notice her absence. She had not been seen in the hallway or outside to collect her mail. The friend who had visited regularly after the baby's birth tried knocking on her door twice, but there was no response. On the second attempt, the faint odor from inside made her uneasy, but she told herself it was probably just trash that hadn't been taken out. Still, the silence felt wrong. By the morning of the 3rd day, that same friend returned, this time determined to see for herself. She pounded on the door, calling out Claire's name, but the apartment remained still. After several minutes, she tried the handle. It was unlocked. The door creaked open, and a sour wave of air rolled out. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, revealing a living room littered with bottles, clothes, and overturned furniture. Claire sat on the floor, knees pulled tightly to her chest, rocking slightly. Her gaze was distant, unfocused, as if she were staring straight through the wall in front of her. The friend stepped further inside, calling Claire's name again, but her voice caught in her throat when she spotted the small bundle on the floor near the crib. The blanket around it was still, and the truth hit before she could force herself closer. A scream tore from her lungs, loud enough to echo down the hallway. Neighbors rushed to see what had happened, and within minutes someone had called the police. When officers entered, the scene froze them in place. The child's lifeless body lay wrapped tightly in the blanket, and Claire made no effort to explain. She didn't resist when they lifted her to her feet, didn't protest when they placed her in handcuffs. Her only movement was the slow, rhythmic rocking that continued as she was led away, her expression vacant, as though she had already left the world behind. The trial that followed gripped the community, drawing crowds of people who wanted to understand how such a tragedy could happen in their quiet suburb. The courtroom was filled each day with reporters, neighbors, and strangers all watching as the details unfolded. Prosecutors presented a grim timeline of events, backed by medical reports that confirmed the baby had suffered repeated injuries in the days before his death. Experts explained how each injury painted a picture of escalating abuse, not a single moment of loss of control. Photos and forensic evidence were shown, leaving jurors visibly shaken. The prosecution argued that Claire's intoxication was not an excuse but a choice, one she made over and over until it ended in irreversible harm. The defense tried to shift the narrative, pointing to postpartum depression and the lack of a support system. They claimed her drinking was a desperate coping mechanism, not malicious intent, and argued that her mental state was too impaired to fully comprehend her actions, but the jury was not swayed. Witnesses, including friends and neighbors, described her growing detachment from the baby and the signs of neglect that, in hindsight, had been there for weeks. Some admitted they wished they had intervened sooner, but others insisted they had no idea the situation had reached such a dangerous point. Claire sat through the trial largely expressionless, her eyes downcast, hands folded in her lap. Only once, when a photograph of her newborn was placed before the court, did she seem to blink rapidly as if holding back tears. When the jury returned with their verdict, the room was silent. She was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's words were final, but the weight of them seemed to barely register with her. In the weeks after, the apartment stood empty. Its windows remained dark, and the landlord eventually boarded them up. For months, residents avoided walking too close to it, as though the building itself had absorbed the tragedy. People spoke of the case in hushed tones, torn between anger at Claire and sadness for what had been lost. The baby's short life became a symbol of a hidden darkness that can exist even in places that seem safe. In the end, the case was not just about one woman's downfall, but a reminder that silence and avoidance can allow the most unthinkable acts to unfold behind closed doors, unnoticed until it is far too late.